Hello and welcome to the CMR audio project. The CMR is the Institute for Coastal and Marine Research at the Nelson Mandela University. I'm David, or Dave if you prefer. I'm now consistently failing to keep these interviews under 30 minutes like I originally set out to do, but I think this is an instance where failure is a good thing because the content is getting pretty darn good. At least I think so. This episode is with zoologist Dr. Gavin Rishworth. You can check out his profile at LinkedIn and other academic platforms. Just search for Gavin Rishworth, Nelson Mandela University. Do note that the views and opinions expressed in the CMR audio project are those of the participants alone and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of any branch of the Nelson Mandela University. Part of the idea of the audio project is indeed to get into grey areas involving opinions that not everyone will share, so let's be patient with each other. If you have any questions or comments about anything you hear in this episode or other episodes, drop me an email, cmraudioproject@gmail.com. Hi, Dr. Rishworth. Gavin, how are you?
All right, thanks, and you?
Good, thank you. Thanks for being willing to do this, man. It's always putting people on the spot to talk about themselves and their research. And I see that you've got some interesting areas of research that I really want to get into. But before I do that, could I ask you just to introduce yourself, tell me who you are, what you do at the university, and anything else you feel might describe yourself for listeners?
Sure, yeah, no, it's an absolute pleasure to be a part of this with you, and great to meet you as well. Yeah, so my name's Gavin Rishworth. I'm a senior lecturer in the zoology department at the Nelson Mandela University. I've been at the university since undergrad, so since back in 2008, I think was my first year, and I've done all of my studies there. I started with the Bachelor of Science, and then I went into an honors in zoology, master's in zoology, and a PhD in oceanography. And then I did a couple of years as a post-doctoral researcher. I was a research fellow for a while, and now I'm fully engaged as a lecturer and a researcher, and I love them both equally.
And what's your link to the CMR?
So my research focus has always been marine. So from my honors year, I studied fish. My master's, I studied seabirds, and my PhD, I studied these coastal seeps called stromatolites, which I think we'll maybe touch on a little bit later. So my focus and my passion has always been the coast and everything to do with it, really, in terms of biodiversity and processes and the way it operates and what it can do for us as humans and what we are responsible for in terms of its stewardship. So the CMR has just been the perfect institute to link towards because of its multidisciplinary focus in everything to do with the coast, and I've been very grateful for that link because it's brought up many opportunities for me in terms of international exposure, collaboration, and to just get involved in many coastal research projects. It's really a fantastic institute to be a part of. And I was based on the ocean sciences as well for a while before I started this position in the zoology department. So there was a natural link with that too. And my wife is also working for the CMR. That's also a great link to have too.
Shout out to Lisa Rishworth. She's so productive on the emails and communication streams. It's great to have you at the administrative helm there, Lisa. Thank you. So you said that you have always been interested in things like biodiversity and coastal life. What took you there as a child, or what sparked your interest when you were younger to look more closely at biodiversity, the creatures and creepy crawlies on the coastline in general?
Yeah, I've always been an outdoors kid. Animals have been by far my greatest passion in life. My grandparents and my parents took me fishing, and I've just always loved animals. For as long as I can remember, I've had animal books in my room and used to just spend hours paging through that. Whenever I visited my grandparents, I was always the channels. I wasn't interested in the cartoons. I wanted to switch on National Geographic and Discovery Channel and watch that. So the natural world has always been my fascination and my passion. And I actually, when I was at school, I thought that because you're interested in animals, the only option in terms of a career would be as a vet. It was always my plan to be a vet. I never actually knew that a career in research and science was was an option. I don't know why. I don't know. I never just made that link that those scientists on National Geographic, that could be a legitimate career for me. I don't know if that's my own fault or if it was a fault of career guidance or whatever, but I just never made that link. So I actually applied for veterinary science and was going to go study that. And then I realized that I was equally passionate about people. I've always had a passion for the human mind and why we do the things we do. So I actually registered at, back then, the Nelson Mandela Metropolitan University to do psychology. And that's what I was accepted in. I suppose as an 18-year-old, you're never too sure who you are really. And well, you're not always sure and you're not sure what your passions are. So that first day was approaching and I realized that, no, my passion has always been animals. So maybe I should reconsider the vet thing. And then I thought the easiest route to that would be to do a BSc. So I made the switch between psychology and BSc, and I never looked back. BSc was by far the greatest serendipitous event of my life, really, I suppose, just because it made me realize that these researchers are actually here in South Africa too, and I can actually be one day. So that was a fantastic opportunity for me, and it combined my passion for academia that I always had but never knew I had, and my passion for animals. So that's how I got into this space.
I'm still interested in your passion for being outdoors and the creatures of the marine environment. Did your parents encourage you to go outside a lot when you were younger?
Oh, yes, yeah. That was, I mean, we grew up here in PE, just in the normal residential suburbs. So it's not like I stayed on a farm or anything like that. But my grandparents, we often went to visit them and went on fishing holidays with them, and that was very much a focus of spending outdoors. My parents bought me like bug boxes and things like that I would go into the garden and search for creatures to have a look at. And I was very interested in just seeing what animals were around there. And my parents very much limited the amount of screen time that we had. So we literally had a book at home that my brother and I had to sign in when we wanted to watch TV, and we had to sign out on that book. I say it as a joke, but I think it really did help us to engage with other activities, and the outdoors was always one of my main passions. So it was definitely very much an encouragement from them to get involved with gardening and being outdoors and helping out with the chores outside and mowing the lawn and all of those sort of things. So outdoors is definitely where I enjoy it the most.
So there's two hints and tips for parents wanting their kids to be more engaged outdoors. One is a clock-in schedule timer book for screen time. I like that. And two, simple things like the bug box. Can you just describe the bug box for anyone who may not know what that is? I know what it is because when I was a kid, we had those kind of things. We didn't have so many screens around us. Now kids, it's just all screens for them. So what's a bug box?
Yeah, it's essentially just well, it can be any shape, really. It can even just be an old ice cream container. But it's essentially the bug box that I remember was a triangular-shaped wooden frame box. 3 of its sides were solid, and the 2 ends had sort of wire gauze on each of the end. And it had a little trapdoor that you could open, and you could basically then put whatever creatures you found in the garden, be it a snail or cricket or a spider even. My mom never liked it when I found a spider. You could put it in there, close the trapdoor, and because it had the wire gauze, you could watch what the creature was doing. And that was, I remember that very clearly. It being one of my favorite pastimes, was just seeing what I could find and just watching it and seeing what it did. And I suppose later in life I started to think about why it did what it did, but it definitely sparked a lot of the interest back in those days. And I mean, you can do it simply with, you can even just be a little plastic container and catching tadpoles in a pond at home, or mosquito larvae, and seeing what happens to them as they grow up. I used to do all of those. It's definitely instilled a wonder in nature for me.
I think when I was younger, we also had silkworms, and you see the transformation from the larvae or the worm or whatever. Sorry, I'm no zoologist. I just love nature and being outdoors and staring at bugs and things, and then seeing them transform into moths, right? And just the silk cocoon that they come out of. So I suppose that could even be a early focus on transformation, this metamorphosis that a creature or life undergoes. So you were doing research when you were really young just by staring at bug boxes. And I love the fact that your parents encouraged that by giving you bug boxes. That's brilliant. Thank you for that tip. And any parents listening who are worried about their kids on the screens all the time, give them something to do, man. Like, I've got a bunch of friends whose kids are on screens a lot, and the parents don't seem to know how to get them off. So I think this would be a nice trick to get the kids off the screens. So you mentioned a career in research and science. What does that career look like in practice? So when you're doing research now, it's not staring at bug boxes, right? It's looking way more closely with way more refined tools and methodologies, right? And then also, what are your colleagues doing as part of the projects that you're doing? Are you all doing much the same thing, or are you collaborating? What does this look like in practice?
Yeah, so I'm primarily a zoologist, but also with training in oceanography, and I link very closely with the botanists, those people that study plants. I link closely with geologists, people that study rocks. I link closely with the chemists, people that study the way that molecules interact with each other. So I've certainly benefited a lot in my research and scientific journey in terms of collaboration. And I shouldn't just say benefit. I've realized that is the way to do science, is that you draw from each other's strengths and you link up with good people. You achieve better goals through stronger networks and through working together. So yeah, my research is primarily focused on understanding how animals interact with their environment and some of the pressures that they face and what drives those animals to do what they do. As a zoologist, that's what I'm interested in. The particular environments that I work in are all coastal, so it includes estuaries, it includes the shallow ocean, and these stromatolite systems that I also work in. And yeah, we basically go into the field, so go into these study sites and use a variety of different tools to study these animals without interfering them, but also using things like more fancy bug boxes, I suppose. So using traps and nets and corers to catch these animals, to quantify how much they are, who is there, what they're doing while they're there. We've got a very much a conservation conscious approach to sampling where unless we absolutely have to, we always release the animals back into their natural environments, which is a big shift to how research used to be done several decades ago. But certainly, I'm speaking now just in terms of the zoology department, we all do very different things. So we've got researchers there that focus on top marine predators, researchers that focus on sea turtles, on fish, on African mammals, in the terrestrial environment, on small mammals and physiology. So we've got a variety of different research interests in our department, and certainly in the broader science faculty, botanists and the geologists and all of them. Everybody's got sort of their niche in which they work, but we all, or many of us, are aware of what each other's specialities are, and that's where the real exciting science to me happens, is when we work together to collaborate on broader projects. Certainly many of the research that I've undertaken would never have been possible if it weren't for the expertise of others to supplement what I know about that science. We spend a lot of the time in the field, but equally a large amount of time behind our computers analyzing what we've seen in the field and writing that up and thinking about ways to communicate the science that we've done.
You've mentioned stromatolites twice now. I think I might over-romanticize stromatolites because I'm under the impression, and it could be the wrong impression, that they are some of our oldest ancestors. Is that over-romanticizing them, or is that true? Because I think that they were around like more than 3 billion years ago, and they were there converting some of the early gases, I want to say in the Earth's atmosphere. I'm not sure if Earth had much of an atmosphere then, but they were converting things like nitrogen into oxygen, or it could have been other gases that to us are toxic, but then they were releasing this, at that point, probably toxic gas called oxygen that then became the building block for so much of what we know as life. Is this an accurate way of thinking about stromatolites?
Yeah, I mean, you are definitely not playing up beyond what it should be. So stromatolites are these, just for those that might not know exactly what they are, they're these essentially mats of microalgae, so small photosynthetic, but not always photosynthetic organisms. So organisms that can trap light and turn that into energy. And many of them are microscopic, and they they basically live on shallow aquatic environments, and they do what they do in terms of trapping light energy and metabolizing and growing. But then the key thing that they do is they leave behind calcium carbonate, or basically a chalky substance. And this is essentially a hard substance that then over time builds upon layer, similar, I suppose, in principle to like a tree ring would build upon layers. And this layer then gets left behind, and it's left behind in the fossil record. So we've seen stromatolites as far back as 3.5 billion years, and they've been in the fossil record ever since. They're actually, I did a presentation a couple of months ago terming them life's greatest survivors. So they are the biological organism that has survived all of the major extinctions through life. They've the most long-standing record in the fossil record. All of the sort of real traumatic events that Earth has gone through, stromatolites and their relatives have survived, and they'll likely outlive us as a species even. So that talk, I sort of gave it a bit of a philosophical spin, and these are life's greatest survivors. So what can we learn from these survivors in terms of some of the current crises that we are facing at the moment? But certainly, so if you had to, and one of the other well-known stromatolite scientists used this analogy. If you imagine from your shoulder to your fingertip being the start of life on Earth to where we are now being your fingertip, we as humans have been on this Earth for basically the size of your fingernail. Vertebrates and organisms that we'd recognize as animals, so things like spiders and insects, have been basically from your wrist to your fingertip. From about your bicep to your fingertip is the length of time that stromatolites have been around. In terms of the dominant life form on Earth, it's been things like stromatolites. It's been these microbial mats which form stromatolites. That's what Earth has looked like. The key thing that we know now is that they are incredibly rare in most modern ecosystems. So things like animals have come and grazed them and outcompeted them. The water chemistry is very different. So there just simply aren't as many stromatolites anymore in today's world, which is both, I suppose, not a good thing for stromatolites, but it's also, in terms of where stromatolites are, it's a really important and fascinating opportunity for us to use the modern system to try and interpret what life at the very beginning might have been like. So we've got some living stromatolites, which my PhD supervisor, Professor Renzo Perisonotto, and the manager for the South African Environmental Observation Network, Prof. Tommy Bornman, they discovered these stromatolites here on the Port Elizabeth coast in 2012. And I did my PhD on them from 2014 onwards to basically see these unique systems that we have on our doorstep here in Port Elizabeth. What do they mean? What are they telling us? And how can they be used to infer some of those earliest ecosystems and the processes that were going on in them? But you're absolutely right. Also, you mentioned about the early atmosphere. So it was about 2 billion years ago, what was then a poisonous gas, oxygen, started to be released by photosynthetic organisms. And many of these organisms lived within stromatolites. They were protected by the structure of stromatolites, and certainly stromatolites started to release oxygen. So ultimately, all oxygen-breathing creatures owe their existence to organisms like stromatolites. We wouldn't have been here if they didn't go through that dramatic change, or at least we might have looked very different if it weren't for oxygen.
So you've now spoken for something that's written at your profiles. You've got several profiles on things like ResearchGate and LinkedIn, and you write there that one of your main research interests is exploring the links between past and present ecosystems and highlighting why modern environments operate under the constraints to which they are currently exposed. Could you talk a little bit now about some of those constraints? You've mentioned grazing, and I'm thinking, well, haven't animals always grazed off of coastal environments? What's different now that's causing this decline in the stromatolites?
Yeah, so like I mentioned before, the selling point of modern stromatolites is that they can be used to interpret what their past extinct analogs or cousins might have operated under. And one of those things is the modern presence of things like grazing invertebrates and animals who, in most modern coastal environments, go about their ecology by grazing and burrowing and moving within the sediment and eating algae and eating microbes and eating seaweed and eating whatever is available to them, the detritus in the environment. And in that process, in most systems like estuaries and shallow seas, they disrupt and they disturb and they rework the environment. And anything that requires layering, that requires sort of a stable environment like a stromatolite to deposit these layers over time, gets disrupted by this grazing. And it was about 540 million years ago in what's known as the Cambrian explosion was when life as we know it in terms of the major invertebrate lineages evolved and radiated at that time, about 540 million years ago. And that gave rise to many different forms of life, more active grazers, more active reworkers of the sediment, larger organisms, more mobile organisms, and all of that contributed to disturbing environments. It created more opportunities for life in other ways. For example, things like coral reefs evolved and so on. But it meant that for the stromatolites, which required a stable environment to grow, it meant that these were disrupted. So in the modern situation, we only find stromatolites where these grazers are excluded. So in things like hypersaline lakes, waters which are almost twice the salinity of seawater, or waters where there's some other chemical that excludes grazers. So with those grazers being excluded, these stromatolites are then able to flourish. But what our research has shown, which is actually perhaps even more interesting, is our stromatolites grow where grazers are active. So we have a very diverse grazer and invertebrate community living within our stromatolites. Even to the point that it was the year before last that we described a little invertebrate. It's about the size of a rice grain, and it's living within the stromatolites, and we found it nowhere else other than within stromatolites. We actually named it Cynolobus stromatoliticus. As far as we know, it only lives within the South African stromatolites. And the reason why we think that these invertebrates are living within the stromatolites without destroying the stromatolites is that this stromatolite environment on the coast is actually providing an ecological refuge to these species. So it protects them against some of the sort of harsh conditions like oxygen fluctuations, temperature fluctuations, because they can burrow within the stromatolite and sort of this forms like a little home for them. This is one of the hypotheses that we're busy unpacking at the moment in my research, but we thought it was really interesting that there are these creatures living within our stromatolites without disrupting and destroying the stromatolites. One of the other constraints that stromatolites are experiencing at the moment is the natural chemistry of the water. Stromatolites need supersaturation, or they need lots of calcium carbonate in the water in order to form their structure. Most modern waters don't have calcium carbonate because things like shell-forming organisms, coral reefs, all the invertebrates that form shells, these shells are comprised of calcium carbonate. So these organisms basically sucked out the calcium carbonate from most waters, and stromatolites then can't grow. So our sites here off the Port Elizabeth coastline, the groundwater feeding these systems, which we've got an excellent, or she just graduated with her MSc, Carla Dodd. She did a lot of calcium carbonate work with one of the researchers in the geosciences department, Callum Anderson, and basically found out that our stromatolites are fed by groundwater that is very rich in calcium carbonate. And it's these unique conditions along our coastline which is creating this opportunity for the stromatolites to form.
The constraints aspect really has been more my research interest. My research has taken me to look at general trends in the decline of biodiversity, freshwater contamination. I think everyone knows about the decline, and I don't want to labor them with more bad news. What do you think about this decline? Is it real? Is it being overemphasized by sensationalist-style media? Or is it something that just ebbs and flows? Are human beings doing stuff that's as bad as a lot of us think it is?
That's a really interesting discussion, and it's not always necessarily an easy answer, but I actually teach an honors level course, Global Change and Biodiversity, where we unpack some of these discussions. And one of the key messages that I always try and bring across, or try and get the students to think about, is global change, is that just a natural cycle that's going on, or are humans causing it? What does the evidence show? And same, is the biodiversity decline that we're experiencing now, is that just a natural cycle, or is that induced by anthropogenic or human impacts? And the evidence is, at least to my mind and the mind of many people, unequivocal that biodiversity decline is very real. It's definitely a cause of many of the human impacts, like overexploitation, land use change, but also linked to climate change and just species not being able to adapt and shift their ranges fast enough. So biodiversity is often a measure of the number of species in an ecosystem, for example. And in many cases, the biodiversity of a specific habitat might not necessarily always show a decline, but might just show a complete compositional change. So things like alien invasive species and new species are moving into these habitats without the biodiversity necessarily declining. The number of species might be staying the same, but the compositional change is completely reworking. And this idea was really brought about by one of our CMR collaborations with the University of Oldenburg, their Helmholtz Institute for Functional Marine Biodiversity, which we collaborate with. They've done a lot of work in this biodiversity change being less about species change and more about compositional change and reworking of ecosystems. So that's quite a recent idea that we've been unpacking. But one of the other sort of more recent studies that we've also found is that the biodiversity change is happening faster and more substantially in marine environments than what is happening on land. And this is linked to some of the features of these two habitats, but also the constraints of the organisms and the pressures involved in these habitats. So certainly it's definitely something that we can't ignore. And even if not just for the sake of biodiversity and caring about where the species disappear, the ecosystem services and the benefits that these species have, and just even the economic sense that it makes to protect these species and the processes that they operate under, it almost baffles my mind that we don't care more about this. Probably the most scary recent finding was the Intergovernmental Panel for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. They published a report a year or two ago, which was the largest ever assessment of species and their threat and their status on the earth. And they basically showed that there are at least 1 million species that are at very real risk of extinction at the moment. And that's a tremendous number. And we don't even understand, for example, this Cynolobus stromatoliticus live in the stromatolites. We barely even knew that it was there. And there are so many other species like that. So let alone knowing what role it actually might play in an ecosystem, or what potential future benefit or service it could provide. Never mind just the wonder for people with their bug boxes that might want to go and have a look at the little creatures like this.
My original aim with this audio project was to try and stick to 30-minute interviews, including the intro and outro. So I apologize to listeners for failing to stick to the 30 minutes. We've already hit 30 minutes in our conversation, but this is good stuff. It's an opportunity to foreground certain issues that I think are important. You're doing the same thing. So you're talking about a biodiversity loss. There's a variety of indicators that show that we're in a bit of trouble as far as the network of life on this planet goes. So I was part of the Occupy movement back in 2011 to try and draw global attention to these kinds of issues, although there were a bunch of people on board trying to do various different things. So who knows what it was really about, but that's why I was there. And then came back to South Africa from England to embark on what I thought was a soft treading lifestyle. Permaculture based, very sweet and simple, cheap and cheerful, small cabin, small solar system, small off-grid water catchment, compost toilet, those kinds of things. Yet I'm not seeing much evidence that that's going to encourage other people to tread more softly or live any differently. And of course, I'm coming from, quote unquote, a privileged position as well, where I can choose that kind of lifestyle. When I mentioned this to Mandy Lombard, who, by the way, was episode 4 on this audio project, she seemed to think that it was more about systemic changes that aren't about individuals doing things, but you need structural changes. So you could summarize this as being a chasm between individual agency and system structure. Neither of these seem sufficient to change the direction of the ship, right? Do you have any thoughts on any of this?
Yeah, I mean, firstly, I absolutely commend individuals like you that choose this lifestyle and advocate so strongly for this, because it really is inspiring for many of us to think about how we can adapt our lifestyle like that, and certainly realizing all the problems that are going on in the world in terms of anthropogenic impact on the planet. We simply can't ignore these types of things. One of the things that I feel quite strongly about is that it's not necessarily that every person needs to do things perfectly, but it's more that every person needs to do something small or make small differences to their lifestyle, even imperfect changes, but just along the right trajectory, which will make the largest cumulative impact. So if every single person does something small, it will create a bigger change than only a few people doing everything perfectly, if that makes sense. And I think there's certainly a place for both. There's a place for the systemic change, but there's also a place for the individual impact. We're getting there. I certainly think I'm generally an optimist, and I certainly see more awareness, more realization that we can't keep polluting the way we do. We can't keep eating as much meat as we do. We can't keep living the consumerism lifestyle that we do. And I think that is changing. But I also think that the systemic change in terms of what our largest impact is on this planet is, and there's no doubt, is that the human population is large. It's larger than, I can't remember what the term was, but we just passed the day a couple of weeks ago in terms of the amount of resources that the Earth has to sustain the human population was passed a couple of days ago. So we're now living in borrowed resources essentially for this year. Every year they mark that day. So we just simply don't have enough resources to look after the population as it is. But you also need to look at the way, why do people have why is the population growing so much? You can't begrudge people for having more children than what they are, so for having more than 1 or 2 kids. In societies where healthcare is not strong and where you don't know whether your child is going to grow up into adulthood, you need to have more kids to ensure that your household continues. So that's a societal issue with regards to the economic situation, but also it's been very clearly shown that education decreases population growth, and I think that's gaining traction. But there's so many different elements to weigh up. But certainly addressing education, and I feel very strongly about this as an academic and as a university lecturer, that education and creating awareness and insight and getting people to think for themselves and not just accept what's been told to them is very much an indirect way in which we can solve this problem.
You mentioned increasing access to public health, for example. How do we get our political leadership to do what they're supposed to be doing? Because, this is an impossible question to answer, I know, but I'm just reaching out for any perspective. We know that in South Africa, a lot of our resources are squandered, and they could be going to doing the kinds of things, education, healthcare, etc., that you're talking about. Do you have any ideas on how to get our political leadership more accountable and more proactive in this regard?
Yeah, I certainly think that to get leaders accountable requires people to hold them accountable. And who are those people? if not for the citizens of their society. And that requires us both to have and again, I'm going to go back to education, because I really think that if society is educated to not just accept what they're told, but to question what they're told, they might have a stronger voice in voicing their opinions and in voicing when things are incorrect. Because if you're just trained, and I certainly went through the school system not questioning nearly as much as I do now. I think we're trained to just regurgitate facts and not necessarily think for ourselves. If we don't even have education, I think that it's even more difficult. And as soon as you have the masses questioning why authorities are doing what they're doing, I think that accountability will naturally flow more effectively from that. I love the quote by Albert Einstein. He wrote this some time ago. He said that the power of education is not in learning lots of facts, because that you can go to any library to learn, but it's in training the mind to think. I really believe that training people to think for themselves and to think critically is really one of the major benefits of education. And it's probably way too simple thinking, but I think that will solve a lot of the problems the more people start to think for themselves and to question and not just follow because that's what everybody's doing. But let me leave it at that.
Thank you. I appreciate your honesty and willingness to answer such a difficult question. So, final question from me, which is a much simpler, straightforward one. Do you have any recommendations on books, films, documentaries, podcasts, or anything about any topic, not just academic, not just about ecology, that you think listeners might benefit from?
I mean, I do a lot of all of that, but the thing that I'm probably most passionate about is reading. I absolutely love to read. It's one of the main interests that my wife and I share. It's an interest that I've had since I was a young kid. Going back to even my parents, my brother and I, we were paid our pocket money based on the number of books we read. So we got R2 or R5 or whatever it was, depending on every book that we finished.
So bug boxes, a clock timer, and bribery.
Exactly. It worked. I'd like to think that my passion for reading would have happened irrespective of that, but that definitely devoured books when I was young, and it makes it so easy now in my career because I can read really quickly and take in what I read. And I love to read. I love to read broadly. I've read a couple of Stephen Hawking's books lately on physics and understanding life at the very beginning, and not that I understand everything, but on the Big Bang and quantum physics. It just blows my mind, some of those concepts. Probably one of the books I've most recently enjoyed was The Rise and Fall of the Dinosaurs by Steve Brissett. As a kid, I loved dinosaurs, and he wrote this fascinating book about why dinosaurs went extinct and what they were, but he wrote it in such a way that it was so easy to understand. And him as a person is just a really genuine scientist for all that he's achieved. He's so humble about it, and you can just see he values the relationships of other scientists, and he just seems like such a genuine person. And I love that about a person, where they don't have airs and graces necessarily. You can see they're real and they really care and they really are genuine. So I really enjoyed that. And probably another book that I can highly recommend, it's called Range by David Epstein. I don't know if you've heard about the book by Malcolm Gladwell, where we talked about the 10,000 hour rule.
Outliers.
And specialization, and you have to stick to a very specialized course to be successful. David Epstein then basically writes the counter argument to this, and Malcolm Gladwell actually writes the preface to this and says how wonderful it was to be proved wrong. And this book by David Epstein essentially says how generalists thrive in a specialist world, I think the phrase was, and how people that have generalist skills, how they are trained to, or not even, they're unknowingly trained to identify different ways of thinking in different solutions. And he uses a huge amount of examples to look at how just from having a slightly different perspective, you're able to answer questions that specialists might not be able to answer. And I've sort of taken, because I've gone through my whole life, I told you about doing psychology, wanting to be a vet. At one stage, I wanted to be an architect, and I've never, and even science, I've gone from fish to seabirds to stromatolites. So I very much had a whole suite of different interests. But this book really just captured how being a generalist sets you up with a variety of different skills, which actually helps you handle different situations better than necessarily. There's a place for specialists for sure. Like if you're going to be an Olympic athlete, you need to specialize. But I really enjoy that book. I think that David Epstein's Range would be a good one to add to anybody's library.
As a typical generalist, I will second that. Could I ask you, though, with Malcolm Gladwell's Outliers, it wasn't only the 10,000 hours thing. It was also being in the right place at the right time. A lot of those early computer specialists had their 10,000 plus hours racked up under their belt, but they also happened to be in the right school, that happened to have the right computer lab that no other school happened to have, and their opportunities opened up for them. So it's sort of the perfect mix. Do you have the right skills, the right tools, and then when the opportunity comes along, are you ready to take it? I think that's what Gladwell was on about.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. Positioning yourself for success. But sometimes we never know when those opportunities are going to come, so sometimes it helps to have a diverse skill set also so you can grasp the opportunity when it comes your way.
Dr. Rishworth, thank you so much for your time. You have provided a lot of food for thought. This is longer than it should be, but I'm really happy to have... I'm really happy. Thank you very much for all your time.
Great. It's only a pleasure, and thanks for the invitation, and all the best during this weird world we live in at the moment.
Likewise. All right, Gavin. Bye.
Cheers. Keep up. Bye.
That brings us to the end of the episode. Thanks for listening. Questions or comments, go to cmraudioproject@gmail.com. Past episodes are available for download at www.archive.org. Head over to archive.org and search for CMR Audio Project, and you should find the right page. If you would like to download an episode or 2 or 3, you can do so at the website. You can also check out what's happening with the CMR by visiting cmr.mandela.ac.za. Many thanks to Kendall Beeden, who composed and recorded the theme music for this audio project. His email address is kendallbeeden@gmail.com. Thanks again for listening. Until the next time, may the tides of life treat you kindly.